Most tax pros leave a message.
It's Jane. I'm moving on to a TurboTax expert who beat your price. Adam Devine, tell him how I feel.
Hey, tax pro, she's been thinking twice. Best believe TurboTax will beat your price. This is a tax break.
Switch to a TurboTax Live expert and we'll beat what you paid your pro last tax season. Make the switch at TurboTax.com/beatyourprice. TurboTax full service only. Sign up by 12/20/2024 and file by 4/1/2025. Full details at TurboTax.com/beatyourprice.
Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the
it.
writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing isn't
So some
there,
readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by novelist and short fiction writer Dave Goodman. Hello.
Hello.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Let's start off, as always, with the latest publication, which is your debut novel, A Reluctant Spy, which came out just a few weeks ago. Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So it came out on the 12th of September. It's in hardback from Headline. It's also an audiobook and ebook. It'll be coming out in the US in early January, I think January 7th. And it's a spy novel. It is about a guy called Jamie Tulloch, who is a kind of bright young thing at university, but he's come from a kind of fairly tough background. So he hasn't got a lot of the sort of support networks that a lot of people might have. And he signs up for, or he is invited to apply for a thing called the Legends program, which is a MI6 program where people are essentially asked to lead a particular kind of life, quite an offline life, quite a restricted life, and in return they get a bit of support. So they get their student loans paid off, they get kind of looked after, they get found jobs and so on. So it's giving him that stability and that safety net that he doesn't necessarily have coming from where he does. But then the bargain is that at some point you step out of your life and an SIS, an MI6 agent, takes over your life for a few weeks or days, and then you go away on a holiday, they do whatever they need to do, and then you come back and you step back into your life again. But obviously, because it's a novel, that doesn't go to plan, and he ends up having to deal with the outcomes of a mission that he was never supposed to be anywhere near, and complications ensue from that point.
Okay. So when it comes to, I've looked at you kind of other stuff that you've written, other work that you've published. It's a lot of it's sci-fi. So like, how come this debut novel is a sort of contemporary spy thriller?
Good question. Thereby hangs a tale. So I love writing both. I did my dissertation on spy fiction, and I've kind of always been a spy fiction reader. But I've also always been a science fiction reader and writer, and I spent a long time writing SF, writing many science fiction novels and short stories, but not really kind of doing anything with them, just sort of piling them up in a drawer. And then when I started to look seriously at trying to get published and find an agent, I started out by taking one of my science fiction novels, and the one that I thought was the most kind of commercial, which was a near future sort of climate collapse thriller that also is essentially a spy novel. And I wrote that book. I wrote that book about sort of 2015, 2016, and it sat in a drawer. And then I pulled it out essentially as a project to teach myself how to edit, because I think the thing that I was doing was writing drafts and then sort of throwing them over my shoulder and just carrying on writing the next draft of a completely different book. And I think there's quite often two mistakes that novice writers make, one of which is just to write books or book-shaped objects without ever actually trying to turn them into a finished, publishable project, and the other is kind of endlessly tweaking the same project.
Yeah.
I've done both at different stages, but at this point I was kind of chucking these unfinished, unedited books over my shoulder, and I used this book, which was called The Burning Line, to teach myself how to edit. And I then used that to go on query for the first time, because once I'd edited it, I was like, I think this is actually maybe good enough to query. And I sent it out. That got me my agent. And then we ended up, at the same time, I was just starting to see success in science fiction and short fiction. So the short stories were coming out, and I was doing really well, and I really wanted to debut in science fiction because I think it's kind of my first love in a lot of ways. But the book went out, The Burning Line went out on submission and didn't sell, which was for various reasons. There's a lot of discussion about sort of cross genre and kind of things that will sit in both camps equally. But we found that the science fiction imprints were saying, no, this is too much of a kind of commercial mainstream thriller for us. And the mainstream thriller imprints were all saying, no, there's too much science fiction in this book. So it just very neatly fell right between, right through the crack in the middle between those two kind of different kinds of publishers. So my agent said, could you write a straight contemporary spy thriller? And I did. And I wrote a book called The Disaster Club. And that book went out on submission as well. I wrote that quite quickly. I wrote it in the summer of 2022, I think. And that went out, and it did okay. We got fast responses back, and it was only going out to sort of thriller imprints and thriller editors, and it just didn't quite get there. We got a lot of very complimentary rejections. But then Toby Jones, who's the editor at Headline that we're working with on this book, he came back and he said, I can't buy this book because it's too similar to something I've already got, and various boring list fit reasons, but do you have any other ideas? And that was the point at which I said, well, I've got a drawer full of them, and kind of came back and said, here's one, this kind of idea of these cover stories that are actually living people and how badly that could go wrong in interesting ways. And he said, write me a sample for that. And I did. And then we sold the book on proposal. So it's kind of been a winding road.
Wow.
But I think the outcome has been great.
It's such an interesting and unusual route to have taken. So you went on submission with 3 separate novels and then were not picked up by any of those, but an editor liked them, and the third one enough that they said, have you got anything else?
Not quite. I went on submission with 2 and then sold the third one on proposal after writing a sample, which, I think I think it's quite common for working novelists who have 2 or 3 books behind them to sell books on proposal and to sell books in that way. That's very unusual for a debut. But I think for me, effectively, I had demonstrated to this editor, Toby, I had demonstrated that I could write quickly, could write pretty decent stuff fairly fast, because he'd seen a book come to him. And when an editor's looking at a debut novel, they're like, did this person write this in a year or did they write it in 10 years? No real way to tell apart from just asking them directly. Whereas he had seen 2 books from me in relatively swift order, and I think he said, maybe I'll have a chat to this guy. And thankfully, we were able to find an idea we both liked, and I was able to write it pretty quickly.
What was the time frame like for when you went on submission with the first one?
So I got my agent in November of 2021 with The Burning Line, I had a hell of a week. I sold my first pro-rate short story, and I was like, this week cannot get any better. And then that same week I got an offer of rep from Harry, or in fact, no, he requested. That's my agent, Harry Ellingworth. He requested the book, and then I think got agented in November of 2021. Went on submission in February, so it was quite quick. I think Harry was quite happy with the state of the book, and we went out quite quickly. It kind of lingered for a while. I started writing another book that summer, which was The Disaster Club, and that kind of slowly died. It died quicker because it was going to thriller imprints, who I think tend to turn things around quite quickly because most thriller imprints are reasonably big and have enough editors so they can turn stuff around quite quickly. And I think that I'm trying to remember the order of events now. We kind of accepted it was dead towards the end of 2022, and in February of 23, we got an email from Toby saying, if nobody bites on this book, I'd love to chat to David about anything else he has. And we had that first initial chat in March of 2023. I was away at the time. Actually, I was at a writing retreat that a couple of friends of mine had organised in Wales. So we had that chat on the Monday, and I'd had all these plans at the writing retreat to work on a edit of a big science fiction novel. And Toby had sort of a few pitches from me, and he said, can you write me a sample of this one? So I was like, well, I'm in a remote former mining village in Wales with nothing else to do, and it's raining, and there's terrifying goats outside. So I think I will sit down and write this for the week, and wrote the first 15K in that week. And then he took that sample, he went away and chatted to his acquisitions team, and then he came back and he said, can you write a little bit more? And I did. I kind of expanded it out to about 40K. And then we got the green light in June of last year, and I wrote the rest between June and September. And then it went into the production pipeline after that. So it was pretty quick. It's interesting because I spent most of my time very focused on developing my knowledge and my networks and other writer friendships and contacts in the science fiction space. So all of my reference points are for how science fiction imprints work. And they tend to be a bit smaller, and they tend to have smaller lists. So it's been really interesting to kind of be dropped into the thriller world and see how that works, and it tends to work a little bit faster. They have bigger lists, they have more turnaround times and things like that. So it's been fascinating to see.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so interesting that experience, that kind of route for publishing a novel, getting picked up on a proposal, and then having not actually written the book, but sort of getting the green light to do it, that as a debut is so rare. That's much more something you would expect from someone who had previously published and they were sort of following up on a second or third novel.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm hoping that will mean, fingers crossed and touch wood, but I hope that will mean my second book is not as painful as some of my friends have told me their second books were, because they're spending 3 or 4 years writing their first book, and then they have to do their second book under the pressure of the reception of the first book and production timelines, and I think a lot of people fall at that hurdle because it's a very, very different experience, whereas essentially that's what I did with my first book. So.
You sort of skipped out the whole debut thing and just went straight onto the second novel.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote plenty of books before this one got purchased, so I've definitely had the experience of noodling around with a novel for a year or 2 years, but I think this experience has stood me in pretty good stead, I think, for the future.
Yeah, definitely. So it was about 2 years that you were kind of on sub with both of those first books that actually didn't ever make it to a publisher. Yeah,
and I think there's a part of me that is like, well, that could have been crushing, and kind of was, and it was pretty tough, like hearing no's over and over again. But I think one of the things I did before I sat down to really focus on trying to find an agent and trying to get published was to have a word with myself, essentially, and say, you're now going into a new kind of realm of writing, the writing world, where you essentially have 2 jobs to do. You have the writing job and you have the author job, and that author job is kind of very much separated and very different from the writer job. And it's possible that you won't get anywhere, and it's possible that you might get somewhere but then get repeatedly kind of crushed and told, no, this isn't the right book, write another book. And I kind of sat down and said, if that happens, how you react to it is probably going to be fairly critical in whether you actually get to the finish line or not and get a book published. And I think that because I'd had that word with myself to say, it might not be this first book. You might have to write another 2, 3, 4, who knows? You might need to keep going. And I kind of wanted to separate the publishing side from the writing side, because if you tie them together too tightly, I think, then the ups and downs of the publishing side can really suck the joy out of the writing side in a way that makes it much harder to write. So I very consciously kind of separated them and said, I'm going to write regardless. So then the kind of other side of my personality, the publishing side of my personality, can take the work from the writing side of my personality, and that the writing side can mostly just get on with it. And I've been semi-successful in kind of compartmentalizing my brain that way. I don't always succeed, but it does really help, I think, to think of it as two very separate jobs, even though the product of one is the input to the other.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very sort of like switched on way of setting your expectations if you're like looking to get into this industry. Was that kind of something that you thought to yourself once you'd signed with Harry, once you were on submission to editors, or was that a thought that came to you earlier, sort of when you were started querying to agents?
Yeah, I think it was there right from the start, because the precondition to getting a book ready to the point where I felt it was ready to query was figuring out my writing routine and making it sustainable, because it really wasn't sustainable before. I used to have these sort of seasons of writing where I would write feverishly for a couple of months and then I would stop writing and feel bad about it, just feel bad about the fact I wasn't writing, and be really miserable, and consider giving up, and in some cases give up for 6 months or a year and then come back to it. And I just was like, this feels horrible, like this, just not writing sometimes, writing other times. And there would be moments where I'd be like, this feels amazing, I'm getting loads done, I'm really excited about the story, and then that motivation would drop away, and I would end up sort of just looking at what I'd done and being like, ugh, this is terrible, I'm never going to get anywhere. So I was like, I have to figure out a way to repeatably and sustainably and healthily do this work that isn't whatever I'm doing now, because it wasn't working for me. It was making me kind of unhappy, and I think the work I was producing wasn't great as a result. So because I was kind of doing a lot of heavy thinking about how to do it, I was very focused on how do I do something that I can keep doing year in, year out without it being hugely impactful on my ability to live the rest of my life, do my day job, just exist, be a good husband, be a good brother and son to my family. And I think having that conversation with myself meant that I was able to sort of sit down and say, okay, but once I start interacting with the publishing ecosystem and agents and editors, there's going to be various pressures on me. How do I maintain that? And I think that thinking about it as early as possible and focusing on getting my routine as sustainable as possible, I think has really helped.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you kind of, I feel like nailed it. You really like approached it with a very serious kind of thoughtful way. And was it a long querying road for you, or once you started querying, did you find Harry quite quickly?
It was medium long.
Medium,
I think
okay.
I think there's a lot of, especially now, because the querying landscape of 2021 was quite different to today. It's not unusual, I think, for people to be waiting on just even an acknowledgement for 6 to 9 months and sometimes never getting it. Whereas back in 2021,
Shop Macy's VIP sale going on now. Use your coupon or Macy's card and take an extra 30% off the latest fall trends from designers that rarely go on sale. And save 15% off skincare, makeup, fragrances, and more. Plus, shop fall specials for even more great deals on top brands at Macy's. Savings off regular and already reduced prices. Exclusions apply.
Most agents, most of the time, still responded, or at least would tell you no. So I think I queried 56 agents over the course of about 3 months. I kind of got them out there relatively quickly. And back then, the kind of recommendation was to find people who responded quickly using tools like Query Tracker, that has kind of aggregated data for how people respond. Find a few fast responders, send them your query, see how they respond, and then make changes. I did that and didn't get any responses, so I decided to go, okay, I'll just start putting it out there. And I essentially tried to treat it like very boring, though high stakes data entry, and just try and do 2 or 3 queries a day and just get them out there one after the other, and try not to attach too strongly to the outcome of any one query. And I think that helped, because I was just putting them, it was still horrible. I still, it feels like the querying process and the agenting process is like the worst possible system apart from all the others. It feels like the one we've landed on. It doesn't mean it's perfect, and it does a number, I think, on a lot of people's motivation and kind of energy to write, because it's full of ups and downs and just so much wasting and limbos. And
it's all subjectivity as like most of this industry is, but there's a lot of the time you haven't met the agent, you haven't had a long discussion about what literature they like or what they think is currently working in the market. So you're basically you can sort of read a bio, which I've spoken to enough agents to know that they don't update them that regularly.
No.
And you could be reading a bio and just suddenly think, wow, this is the perfect agent. This is the one. And then, like you said, it's easy. Like, you kind of stopped yourself getting attached to any one submission, but it's so easy to be like, oh no, I've sent 5 submissions out, but there's that one who I just think is so perfect. And it's like, you don't really know, you're going off a bio.
Yeah.
You can never know.
You can't. And I think that you can do a lot of research. There's tools you can use, like digging through the bookseller, digging through Publishers Marketplace in the US, Query Tracker, writer discords. There's loads of places, and Reddit's pub tips community is probably one of the best resources I've seen for like querying, getting queries like looked over for free. It's obviously just the internet's opinion, so it's not necessarily 100% valid all the time, but some of the commenters on there are former editors, current agents, and they're just it's a really great community. But I think that casting your net relatively widely and not kind of self-rejecting, not looking at a bunch of agents and saying, oh, he says he doesn't like high fantasy, my book's fantasy. It's not high fantasy, but maybe I won't query him because maybe he doesn't like fantasy after all. That kind of thing. Just interpreting the genres people are asking for as generously as possible, I think, is a very good idea, because querying is really hard. Don't make it harder for yourself by not wanting to bother people. Agents want to hear from you, even though sometimes it feels like they don't.
Yeah, and when they, from the agents I've spoken to, if they're going through a pile of things and they see something which is just a genre or a style that they simply don't represent, don't feel bad, because they'll just say, oh no, I don't represent that, and then that's ticked off for them. That they just put it to one side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
fine.
I wouldn't query people who explicitly say, don't send me your romantasy if they don't rep it. You're kind of wasting your time and theirs. But I would say, if they're like, I like fantasy novels, don't question, well, what kind of fantasy novels? Just send them your fantasy novel and don't worry about it. And I think so much of it is down to timing and what they happen to be looking for at any particular time, that you just have to get as many queries as you can out there and do the best that you can and follow the submission guidelines. And if you're doing those things, you're probably ahead of sort of 95% of the people that are querying anyway. I've heard some absolute horror stories for the kinds of things that end up in agent inboxes.
Oh yeah. I've heard some. I had Megan Carroll on recently, and she mentioned a few sort of horror stories about things that she sees in her queries, but she also mentioned that and in fact there was something recently that she has a very long list, so if she's ever adding something to her list, it's such a big consideration, because she might not have the time, and she came across a query which she absolutely loved, but she looked at her schedule and she sort of realistically looked at it thinking, I could take on this author, but I won't be able to get back to them and like seriously look at this and seriously go out on submission for like 6 months, maybe more, because of everything else that I've got lined up. So she very begrudgingly had to pass on something that she loved. I think it got picked up by someone else, and she was saying she still spies on them to see what the situation is with that book, and she's still mad that she didn't have time to pick it up.
And I think that's incredibly common. Like agents, if they could, they'd probably take on a lot more than of the books they see coming through, and the authors. There's probably a lot of people that they're like, I feel like there's an 80 to 90% chance that I could do something really great here. But I think from what I've seen, most agents, especially the ones who are later on in their career and already have a quite a big client base, they have to save their offers for the 100%. They have to save it for the I absolutely will be bereft if I don't sign this author, because if they're going for people who they're like 80-90% sure about, and they're like, this looks great, I could do great things with it, I think, if they signed all of those, they would just essentially crumble under the amount of work.
Yeah, because they already have a large list of authors that they need to be giving their time to, and a lot of them are like successful authors with recurring contracts and things like that. And the longer the list, the less kind of time they have to look at more other things. Let's get back onto you though. Before we head over to Desert Island, I wanted to ask, because you mentioned this is a spy thriller, and you sort of have almost like a range, and your genres, you go from sort of sci-fi up to these kind of contemporary spy thrillers. And like you were saying before with the first submission, you almost had the issue of being too much in the middle of those two genres that you write in. I imagine you're working on something new. Is it going to be more spy thriller, or is it going to go more towards the speculative sci-fi stuff?
Well, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I'm working on two things at the moment.
Perfect.
Yeah, I am writing a sample for the second book in this series, which is going to go to my editor hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And that's, obviously everything is contingent on how the first book does. I just have a one book deal with an option for a second book. So hopefully the book is doing really well. We're in this sort of weird post-publication limbo where there's not a lot of data yet, and there's not a lot of trends. So we're just kind of, we were very fortunate to get some really great press coverage. We got reviews in the FT, the Sunday Times, and the Sun, which is pretty good spread for a debut author. So hopefully that, combined with just kind of a bit of momentum from reorders and things like that, will get us to the point where a second book is viable. So I'm writing the sample for that. I'm also about to do an edit on a big science fiction novel, which is kind of pure SF. It's set in space, it's set hundreds of years in the future, and it's very much, it's not, I don't think it's going to fall in the gap between genres at all, because it's very much, it's about generation ships and things like that. So, so I'm doing an edit on that with my agent, and then hopefully we'll go out on submission with that later in the year. My objective, and I'm quite open about this, and I talk about it a lot, is to essentially try and emulate what Ian M. Banks did, where he writes, contemporary fiction under one name and then adds an initial for the science fiction. Because I think that's my ideal, really, is to play in both worlds. Because I write relatively quickly, and I think if I was only writing in one genre and kind of waiting for publishing cycles, I would probably get frustrated quite quickly. Whereas if I'm writing in two genres with two publishers, I can alternate, and kind of if I'm waiting for one thing, I can go and write another.
Yeah, and they're two good genres to be in, because you've got thrillers like spy, kind of clandestine thrillers, are very commercial. Yeah. They tend to do very well in terms of sales, and then sci-fi is a bit more niche. So I guess if you get both of those up and running, you've got kind of one kind of covering the other. Because obviously when a sci-fi blows up, it really blows up though, and you get the movie and things like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I remember I went to see Ian Banks once speaking at Waterstones in Edinburgh, and he was talking about that actually, and he was saying it's quite common for interviewers to assume that he did the science fiction stuff as a commercial thing to backstop his more literary fiction. And he said no, it's the opposite. The science fiction is very much the work of his heart that he's doing because he really enjoys it, and the literary fiction outsells it by about 10 to 1. But then obviously occasionally, as you say, a book will blow up and will get adapted, and as a result will become part of that broader cultural and media conversation, which I think makes a huge difference. Yeah,
because it's almost like the potential for a sci-fi novel when it does hit that kind of stride is to just get atmospherically big. Like Three Body Problem, I guess, is the most recent one. Absolutely, to just sort of blow up and be everywhere.
Yeah, although I think spy fiction has the benefit of being relatively more likely to be produced because it people sneaking around in dark alleys. It's not as heavy on the budget.
Yeah, exactly. Fantasy suffers the same issue where there was a phase, I think, after Game of Thrones, obviously all the production companies were trying to get, in quotes, the next Game of Thrones, and they all wonderfully failed. Yeah. But now I speak to people who have having their books optioned and things like that, and it's like the reluctance to do fantasy, and I think to a slightly lesser degree, but still there is sci-fi. It's just so high because taking an option of that, they know that the budget's going to be so big, and if it doesn't land, if you get like the Borderlands movie, which must have had a massive budget and it's just made no money.
I remember reading when The Expanse was being made, because I think before it was with Amazon, it was with the Sci-Fi Channel.
I thought it was Netflix.
I can't remember. It was a while ago. But I remember reading a story that said the executives at the original company called it The Expense rather than The Expanse because it was so expensive to produce relative to other things they were doing. But yeah, I mean, it got rescued and they managed to finish the story, I think, which is great. But yeah, by definition, I think if you've got spaceships or castles or dragons, you're gonna be upping your budget.
Yeah. I don't know if this is true, but I heard a story about The Expanse, whatever it was on originally, and then Amazon picked it up when it got cancelled. And I don't know if this is true, but I heard the story was literally because Jeff Bezos liked the show. So he basically told them to pick it up because he wanted to see the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I want us to rely culturally on the whims of billionaires for whether a show gets continued or not. But at the same time, I'm glad he did because I think it's a story that deserved to be told fully.
Yeah, it's a good one. And that brings us to the point in the episode where we head over to the desert island. So, David, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
So I think the kind of conservationist side of me, and I'm assuming these are books that I actually own, are they? Or
I mean, it could be. No, you have to own it. I've had people making up books to take. So
I think I was gonna say, if I was conserving things, it would be the oldest book I own, which is a copy of Spenser's The Fairy Queen that my grandmother left to me, which is well over 100 years old.
Wow.
But I think really the sort of genre reading side of me would think it would be the book that really blew my mind when I was in my early teens, which is Accession by Ian M. Banks. And I remember reading that and then realising that the author was from Scotland and essentially lived about 15 miles or so away from where I grew up. And it blew my mind that someone who lived in North Queensferry, which is, this slightly rainy town on the north side of the Firth of Forth, had written this book about giant AI spaceships talking to each other and dealing with an intrusion on our reality by another reality and what that meant. And it's essentially a spy thriller. It's about a bunch of these culture minds like trying to do some skullduggery to try and fix this situation, but it's told almost in like instant messages. Like there's a bunch of messages between these ships as they talk to each other, and I'd never read a book that had this kind of formatting or told a story in this way. And it basically reconfigured my brain when I was about 14 and essentially said, you can do pretty much anything you want, and it doesn't matter really where you're from or what sort of stories you're supposed to tell or what stories are worthy or interesting. You can do what you like, and you can do what you like with any technique you like. And I think realizing that when I was 13 or 14 just completely changed my brain and changed the way I thought about writing.
Okay, that's cool. It's almost more important about the kind of geography of where Ian Banks was from more than the kind of story itself in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's quite a common experience among writers in Scotland in their 30s and 40s. I've definitely heard 3 or 4 other people say the same thing. They read this book and it just broke their perception of what writing could be.
Yeah.
It's a cracking book. I think it's possibly my favourite of the culture novels.
I'm trying to think if I definitely have had a similar moment in terms of reading something and just being like, this is writing on a level beyond what I previously kind of comprehended. And I'm like, it was the Watchmen, Alan Moore's graphic novel.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that and just kind of stopping between a lot of the chapters and thinking, how does a human being conceptualize on this level? This must have been, and obviously I know that it doesn't all happen at once. It's in the edits, it's in the redrafts, but it's just, there's a level of writing sometimes that I'll see and I'll just think, wow, this is incredible. This is like the peak of literature. That similar kind of experience, I guess.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that reaction where I finish a book or I get to the end of a chapter and I just sort of exhale because I didn't realize I was holding my breath. And it's maybe not because of what's actually happening in the book, the kind of tension of the scene or the characters interacting. It's just that I can't believe what I just read. Like, how the heck did he come up with that?
Yeah, the craft of it.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's possibly my peak experience. That's what I read for and what I write for is to create and to read things like that. Definitely.
Those kind of moments. Amazing. But that's a great choice. Something that really, it sounds like it like had such a big impact on you and probably is the first block to fall leading up to your career as an author, I imagine.
Definitely.
So next up, we're going to chat about film and TV, planning and pantsing, and our favorite spy and sci-fi stuff. But that will be in the extended cut available on Patreon. So, but that's all the time we've got for today. Thank you so much, David, for coming on the podcast and telling us all about your experiences in publishing and about the new book, A Reluctant Spy, which is out right now in all the usual places. It's been really cool chatting with you.
Thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan, and it's a life ambition to have appeared on this podcast.
For anyone wanting to keep up with what Dave is doing, you can follow him on Twitter at Words by Goodman, on Instagram at Dave Goodman Author, on Blue Sky at Dave Goodman, or on his website davidgoodman.net, where he does still blog. So that's probably the best place to find him. To support the podcast, like, follow, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Join the Patreon for extended episodes ad-free and a week early, and check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again, David, and thanks to everyone listening. We will catch you on the next episode.
Did you know Tide has been upgraded to provide an even better clean in cold water? Tide is specifically designed to fight any stain you throw at it, even in cold. Butter? Yep. Chocolate ice cream? Sure thing. Barbecue sauce? Tide's got you covered. You don't need to use warm water. Additionally, Tide Pods let you confidently fight tough stains with new Coldzyme technology. Just remember, if it's gotta be clean, it's gotta be Tide.
Shop Macy's VIP sale, going on now. Use your coupon or Macy's card and take an extra 30% off the latest fall trends from designers that rarely go on sale. And save 15% off skincare, makeup, fragrances, and more. Plus, shop fall specials for even more great deals on top brands at Macy's. Savings off regular and already reduced prices. Exclusions apply.
Decisions.
Wait a minute. Are you still looking for cars on Carvana?
Yeah. Decisions.
When I used Carvana, I found the exact car I was looking for in minutes. Bought it on the spot.
Electric or full diesel? Decisions.
Come on, you've been at it for weeks. Just buy it already.
You're right. Crossover it is. Decisions decided.
Whether you know exactly what you want or like to take your time, buy your car the convenient way with Carvana.